So when you think of COVID-19, you may not think of dating, but social distancing and quarantine measures have made dating very complicated. And we've seen this sort of pop up in, for example, health briefings from governments. And dating apps themselves are a technology that have been mentioned. So for example, Newfoundland's health minister was on record as saying that if you use Tinder or Grindr and you swipe right, you might get more than you bargained for. Dating apps that are on our phones tend to use geolocational technology to locate those who are around us and facilitate connection with them, right? So the main sort of way that these apps are designed is to facilitate in-person meeting. And so these apps get implicated when meeting in person actually becomes something that is highly risky and potentially dangerous. So there have been op-eds that came out early in the spring about dating app companies and how they have to do something in relation to COVID-19. Otherwise, they might have blood on their hands in terms of users contracting the virus and dying, as we've seen high death rates in some countries. At the same time, there has been a surge in use of dating apps. So several companies such as Tinder have reported that people during lockdown times are jumping on their apps more to connect with others and perhaps to address some of that loneliness that the previous speaker mentioned. And so this creates a situation where dating app companies actually must respond to the pandemic. There's public health pressure for them to respond. They have to prove their relevance in a world where you may not be able to meet up in person anymore. So then why would you need a dating app? And this is also can be seen by these companies as an opportunity to capitalize on people using their technology more during this time. So myself and my co-researchers were interested in this question of how are dating and hookup apps responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as associated public health guidelines and restrictions. So we took an approach of mixed methods. One approach that we took was non-participant observation on 16 apps. So getting on the apps and seeing what are the actual messages sent to users, what sorts of features and interventions might they be introducing. We also collected materials that dating app companies were circulating. So grabbing screenshots of their blog posts, their Instagram posts, stories, press releases, and analyzing what are the messages that they're putting out there for their users and for the general public. And we contextualize this by looking at news and media articles published in English about dating during the context of a pandemic. So today I'm going to share with you just a few key themes that are coming up in all these materials that we've been collecting and analyzing. And the first is looking at the way that dating apps are shifting into the role of being public health actors, looking at how they're introducing practices related to virtual dating, and how they are putting out messaging that is intended to normalize social distancing and this form of virtual dating. Okay, so to jump into that, what you see here are some screenshots from in-app messages to users taken from the sort of beginning March 2020, when North America, Canada and the US specifically were starting to really go into social distancing measures and lockdown. And a lot of these app companies are based in the US, so they would be affected around that timeline. And so these are messages that they sent directly to their users in the app, letting them know that we recommend that you keep dating, but keep things online. So very much taking a direct approach, saying don't meet up right now during this time, and also often linking users to the World Health Organization guidelines. So sociologist Deborah Lupton writes about digital health technologies as a wide range of technologies that generally engage in activities to promote health and well-being and avoid illness. And here we can see that these dating apps are sort of taking on the role of commercial digital health technologies by doing that, by conveying this information about COVID-19. For apps that their primary user base happens to be queer men and gay men, a lot of the time they were mobilizing initiatives and infrastructures that already existed for spreading awareness and information about STIs and HIV, and then also testing for HIV and STIs. So if you got tested for COVID-19 through a similar sort of infrastructure, you could let the app know, and the app would then let people who you've been in contact with know that you got tested and they should go get tested. So it's interesting that these pre-existing sort of initiatives have also been mobilized to help trace COVID-19. A lot of apps put out messaging that recognize that health is something that is interconnected in many different ways. As we just saw, there's lots of different factors that shape people's health. And so some of their messaging acknowledged this, trying to send out messages to users about upkeeping their mental health, their sexual health, as well as diminishing their risks for COVID-19. So this was some of the messaging that we saw that kind of addressed that more holistic view of health. So many of these apps also rolled out features and functions to support virtual dating. And virtual dating is a phrase that showed up in a lot of the messaging that we saw, and it wasn't often defined by these apps, and sometimes was spoken about differently in their messaging, but it can be thought of as a set of practices and associated meanings that facilitate and reinforce non-physical interactions. So for some apps, this was a matter of making a feature that was premium free for their users. So for example, Tinder usually only lets you swipe within a certain radius around you. If you pay for Tinder Premium, then you get to swipe with people all over the world. So you could match and chat with someone who's in a totally different country or on a different continent from you. And so they made this feature free for a month during the spring so that people could connect more broadly. And this is also, you can see, it could be a business strategy that if users are taking advantage of this feature and finding it useful for appeasing their loneliness, then they might be more likely to subscribe to Tinder Premium once the feature is no longer offered for free. Some apps rolled out entirely new features. So for example, this is a screen grab of a blog post by Bumble, and it shows that on Bumble now you can put on your profile what they call a virtual date badge to signal that you are open to dating without physical contact, and then you can engage in video calling. So they make video calling available right through their app. There were other apps that also rolled out video calling. The app Match, they called it Vibe Check. So you can video call someone in the app and you can get a good vibe on them. And then there were other apps that, if they were not rolling out these features, they were referring their users to use other platforms such as Zoom. So the idea is that you meet on the app, on the dating app, so it retains its relevance, and then you take it further to get to know the person by moving it to a video conferencing application or platform that they suggest. And so a lot of the time this also took the form of events held by these apps, such as speed dating events, as you can see here. So of course, we're not really used to any of this, and it's new. And when that happens, sometimes new practices are bound to be awkward. And so what we were also seeing from dating app companies are efforts to try and normalize these practices around virtual dating. Part of this has to do with long-standing perceptions that connections made online are not as authentic as connections made in person. And so here you can see Tinder showcasing a tweet that kind of takes a hit at that long-standing perception. And so it says, remember when everyone hid that they met online, and now it's like, ew, you met in society, right? And so trying to normalize this idea of meeting and making a true authentic connection through the dating app without that physical connection. Also in terms of building social scripts and norms around virtual dating, these app companies put out a proliferation of advice columns, tips, lists, suggestions about everything in terms of how to go about virtual dating, right? So you can see, make sure your phone and laptop are fully charged and sanitized. Quite often the advice was to get out of your sweatpants and dress up for a virtual date. There were tons of lists of virtual date ideas. So you can cook together, you can order each other Uber Eats, and it's romantic if you guess what the person's favorite food is. And then Match went as far as even employing these experts that you could either call a hotline or you could submit your question online about dating while distancing, and their experts would respond. And you can see here that if the question was, you know, we're in a pandemic, or I just started dating again, should I continue with my plan? Should I continue dating? These companies' answers were always yes, continue dating, just not in person. And often those answers were followed by, here, use some of our online features to connect. But for people to actually jump on board and do something, a lot of the time an activity has to have meaning constructed around it. And so this is where we saw that the dating apps started to construct meanings around social distancing and virtual dating. And a lot of the mainstream apps that mostly are marketed to a heterosexual user base tended to have messaging around romance and the possibility of generating romance if you're having a distanced relationship. So here we can see from OkCupid, they say 85% of our users say it's important to first develop an emotional connection with a partner. Then Coffee Meets Bagel asks their users on Instagram what romantic gestures can be done virtually. And then the blog from Match even asks very opportunistically, lockdown, a time for love? And so here we can see these apps are trying to frame distancing and virtual dating as something that can give rise to romance in this sort of abstinence-based model of courtship that really harks back to traditional dating scripts, traditional heteronormative dating scripts that say that prolonging sexual contact can give rise to more romance. In contrast, apps that were generally marketed towards queer user bases tended to construct social distancing and virtual dating as sexy. That if you're abiding by the guidelines and you're being responsible for yourself and you're being responsible to your community, then that's something that we should applaud as sexy. And so you can see that Grindr interviewed adult entertainers and showcased photos of them on their Instagram, sort of providing pornography as this option for a sexual outlet during the pandemic that doesn't put you at higher risk. Similarly, apps also, we can see in the previous screenshot, the Her app promoting sending nude photos as something that can give a sexual connection but not put you at risk. And then Grindr even went on to sell and give out masks for their users, right? And so you can see here that mask wearing, distancing is being constructed as a very sexually appealing activity. So we're still working through these different findings and trying to put more analysis to them. But just from the examples that I've shown you today, you can see that dating apps have indeed made notable interventions during the pandemic. They've responded to COVID-19. They're not acting like it's not happening. And in their interventions, they have become health information sources. So you can see them getting out messaging and links and resources to their users. And they've also taken steps to try and shape behavior, right? So offering new functionalities for new behaviors that they're constructing as virtual dating, and in turn normalizing non-physical interactions, and making social distancing romantic or sexy, depending which app you're using. However, these are commercial apps, and so we have to be a bit critical in terms of looking at, okay, what role can commercial apps play as digital health technologies? And we need to ask, where is the accountability, right? So a lot of the time app companies, they make decisions about what features to offer, what messages to send out, and users receive these messages and they can use these features, but there's not always a lot of back and forth between what users want and what actually becomes available in an app. We also have to remember that these apps have profit motives, right? So increased uptake during a pandemic means that they could in turn make more money. And so we're seeing, for example, when dating apps host online events, often there are product placements or there's brand sponsorships, and also more people getting on these apps means more data. And especially if they're apps that are taking data about people and their health status, we need to know where that data is going and who it's being shared with. And finally, messages that romanticize distance dating tend to reinforce notions around sexuality that are stigmatized, right? So our society has long associated sex, and especially casual sex, with risk, disease, death, immorality. And in terms of trying to reinforce social distancing, there is a risk of, again, taking this recourse back to this negative view of sexuality. And so I would argue that instead, we need to have a more positive view of people's sexual needs and sexual expression, and know that and acknowledge that that doesn't stop even though we're in a pandemic. So we need to find alternative ways. All right, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Duguay, for that interesting talk. While we wait for a few questions, I have one. My question is about platonic dating apps. So I recently learned of the existence of these things. So it's like a dating app, but it's for finding friendships rather than romantic partners. I was wondering, especially considering what some of the previous speakers have said about loneliness being the biggest risk factor for psychological distress, what role these platonic apps might play in interpersonal interactions during this period.
Yeah, I think I mean, what we're seeing from the app companies and the messages that they're trying to put out is that essentially it is, they're trying to play that role where they're helping people address their loneliness, right? And that this can be part of taking care of yourself by making connections with other people. And I think it can be. And some of these dating app companies also propose the use of their apps for making friends. Bumble has a whole subset of its app dedicated to making friends, but also a lot of the apps that are marketed towards queer users say, hey, you can use this to find a pen pal, find a friend, and whatnot. And it puts a little less pressure on people and opens up many different routes of connection. So in that sense, I think it can be really positive. Hopefully there are other studies that go out and look at the user side of how are these messages being received, and if people are, as we're seeing, jump on these dating apps more, then what is the outcome of that for them and their connections?
Thank you.